Good evening, everyone, and welcome to National Council of Jewish Women Arizona's program on prosecuting pregnancy. We're delighted to have you all with us because this is such a significant program. National Council of Jewish Women is, as all of you know, a social justice advocacy organization, but we pursue our advocacy within the framework of reproductive justice. And so the issue of criminalizing pregnancy is something that we have long tried to create awareness for. We testified in the state legislature to try to prevent you will hear about in this program involving the case of an Arizona woman who was criminalized for taking medical marijuana on prescription because of complications from not aware of National Council of Jewish Women Arizona. Please follow us. Please follow all of the work that we do in terms of policy, advocacy, and our newest project, which is developing Ruth Place, the state's first trauma recovery and treatment center for survivors of sexual assault and trafficking. So a month ago, a 36-year-old mother of 6 in Alabama took a prescribed pain pill for severe back pain that she had suffered for years and years. When she delivered, her baby tested positive for opiates, and she was criminally charged by the prosecutor in Alabama. Pregnancy, the criminalization of drug use during pregnancy is not new. There have been over 1,000 documented cases of this occurring in the United States, and more than 500 of those cases did occur in Alabama. Now we have a case in Arizona, as I just mentioned, the case of Lindsay, who took medical marijuana because she was suffering from hyperemesis gravidarum, I think is how you pronounce it, but it's excessive vomiting, dehydration, and she was worried that she might indeed miscarry. Again, when her baby tested positive, she was charged with child neglect. She lost her job as a social in the Department of Child Services, and she is on the central registry. So we have her cases coming up to the AZ Court of Appeals. National Council of Jewish Women has signed on to an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief that was filed by National Advocates for Pregnant Women. We have with us tonight Julie Gunnigal, who is the lead attorney in Lindsay's case. And we are proud to say that Julie is also a board member of National Council of Jewish Women. Julie was a former Cook County, Illinois prosecutor. She narrowly was defeated as the Maricopa County Democratic candidate for county attorney. And she is an advocacy attorney, currently one of the attorneys for Normal. We also have with us tonight, we're very honored to have Lynn Paltrow, who is the founder and the executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. National Advocates is a nonprofit advocacy organization founded by Lynn, whose mission is to defend pregnant people who are punished and criminalized for their behavior, and also to defend the right to terminate a pregnancy. It is Lynn, who I must say I met years ago, who has been shifting the dialogue, who has been leading everybody in realizing that the old vernacular of pro-choice, anti-choice, archaic, that we must framework of reproductive justice and values. We're very privileged to have with us as well Deborah Small. Deborah is an attorney who has championed an alternative response to mitigate the damage from the war on drugs. She is the founder of Break the Chains, a nonprofit organization founded in 2004, which attempts to bring in communities that are disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, and to have them engage in trying to develop an approach to drug dependency that is not within the criminal system, but that focuses on science and human rights and public health. Using the war on drugs has been a combination of restrictions against the most disadvantaged communities, of course, but it has, as I said earlier, become a tool and a weapon in criminalizing pregnancy, and a way to establish a body of jurisprudence that protects fertilized eggs, zygotes, embryos, and fetuses under child endangerment laws, thereby establishing the so-called personhood of the developing fetus. So tonight's conversation will deal with all the ways that both the war on drugs, the anti-abortion movement, the restrictions on reproductive justice are impacting pregnancy. I'm going to turn it over to Julie Gunnigal. She's muted, however.
Sorry, I don't have control over my mute button, apparently. Good evening, y'all. I'm Julie Gunnigal. It's my privilege to be here tonight. I've got to be honest, I'm a little bit starstruck. I've got two of my heroes and my courageous client, in addition to all of you and the incredible Sylvia Tamarkin on the line. And I'm just so excited to have an amazing program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my client, Lindsay, and have her tell her story to you so that you understand what you were a part of in NCJW signing on to this amicus brief, and talk a little bit about why it's so important that we reframe the conversation with respect to pregnancy and to the war on drugs, because the system isn't broken, the system is working exactly as it's designed, and it is harming people every single day. So without any further ado, Lindsay, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being so courageous and sharing your story with us.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Ridgel, and I do have Silas here with me. So you will probably hear him a little bit in the background. He's trying to hide under what I have my phone on. So it might be a little loud, but so I found out I was pregnant in 2008 when I was really, really sick and I had missed my period. Oh, hey, don't take the phone. And I took a pregnancy test, and lo and behold, I was pregnant. I had been using medical marijuana already. And so when I found out I was pregnant, I tried to stop, but my nausea was so bad that I wasn't able to stop. I tried multiple times. I ended up in the ER 2 times because I was so nauseous and dehydrated. I needed fluids, IV medication. And when I went into the hospital, they ended up diagnosing me with I'm not even sure how to say it, hyperemesis gravidarum. And so I was given a prescription for Zofran, which is not the best prescription. It has possibly heart risks, and it didn't work. It just made some other GI symptoms worse. It was not helpful. So let's see, throughout the whole pregnancy, I was nauseous and vomiting almost daily. I was just talking with Julie when we did our interview for the Daily Beast. I remember throwing up in the parking lot one morning on the way to work. I was just so sick, like I couldn't stop. It was horrible. And then as soon as I had my son, the nausea stopped. Like immediately I was fine. I felt better. When he was born, he had some issues, so they took him to the NICU. He was shaky, jittery. When he first came out, he didn't take a breath right away, and they had to give him the breaths of life. They put the little mask on him. They had a whole multiple code teams in there. Very, very scary. He spent 7 days in the NICU. And after those 7 days, they did some MRIs, they did a spinal tap, they did lots and lots of tests, and they found out that he had 2 small brain bleeds, which it says in my hospital records, most likely caused during birth. So they said he was fine. He's not going to have any future developmental delays, any difficulties in health. And so far he's been doing great. He's 2 years old. He's full of energy. He's like the 78th percentile for height and weight. He's very big. And really, I think I attribute his problems that got him into the NICU to the birth injury. I kept him in my birth canal too long because I didn't want to push. I was getting frustrated. I told him I wanted to get a C-section. Like, you can't, he's in your birth canal. You need to push him out. So I attribute it to that. I think if we had started, if we were able to breastfeed right away, I think he would have been less jittery, more, I think he just would have been more calm. So he was out of the NICU in 7 days. DCS came to the NICU, made sure our home was okay, interviewed myself and my fiance, and then they let us go home. They wanted me to do, and their services are pretty intense. It involves drug testing 3 times a week, going to substance abuse treatment, and then also having a DCS case manager and an in-home service team that comes to your house 3 times a week. For the substance exposed newborn program was 4 months. So that was a program that I was a case manager for 2 years. That's a program they wanted me to have those services, to do those services. To me, it just felt ridiculous, especially when I was using a prescribed medication that I had so many cases with. And, it seems so ridiculous to me to do the services. So we denied the services. We drug tested for a month or so, just to show them, it's only marijuana in our systems. I stopped using marijuana. Like I said, at the time, I didn't need to use it. I was feeling great. No nausea, no throwing up from being pregnant. Closed our case after 2 months. Notices, no more drug tests. The letter in the mail. Either I got the letter in the mail or I got an email saying that it was going to be substantiated for neglect due to him being exposed to THC in utero. And I got so what is my employment status? Because you can't have a substantiated case and work for DCS. And I got an email that said, we just received the neglect substantiation, and we're going to start processing your whatever discharge with our employment agencies, whatever. So that was really, really stressful for me. Just having a baby who got out of the NICU and then losing my job. It was pretty crazy. And then I think we kind of decided to make a lifestyle change. We moved up north, closer to my mom, so that she could watch her grandson, watch him grow, and it's turned out so far pretty good. It's been a two-year process, so I'm very, very anxious to see where this is going to go. And reading the brief that you guys submitted was amazing. Just the information, it was great. So thank you. I'm going to put myself on mute if that's okay, just because of the background noise. I hope you guys have been able to hear me. Hopefully it hasn't been too bad.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Lindsay, I'm so grateful for you for coming on tonight and being willing to share your story. Just so everybody knows, when you subject yourself to this process, when you appeal in the state of Arizona, so much of your information becomes part of the public record. And what was so powerful to me in Lindsay's case is it started out to be about her and about her rights to be able to choose the course of her treatment during pregnancy. And since that point in time, it's morphed from being about Lindsay to fighting this law for all pregnant people in the state of Arizona. The other thing you should know is that this is a case of first impression. So Lindsay's specific fact pattern hasn't gotten up to the Court of Appeals before. We have the possibility here to make law and to really make change. And because she was so brave and willing to share this, that we're at that place. With that, I think I'd like to toss it over to Lynn, if I may, to talk about the involvement of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women and how you became involved and what you've been doing and seeing nationally on these sorts of issues.
Thank you both, all of you, so much. National Advocates for Pregnant Women, as you've heard, provides, among other things, pro bono defense for people whose rights are being taken away because of pregnancy. So many of the cases involve an allegation of pregnancy and drug use. And it's drug use, by and large, is not criminalized in this country. It is possession of drugs that's criminalized. So when you hear about these cases, but for pregnancy, Kim Blaylock in Alabama, the case that we've heard about at the beginning of this program, would not have been charged with felony possession of a drug for taking prescription opioids as she was supposed to for her chronic pain. One of the things, so we have been the group, National Advocates for Pregnant Women has documented the more than 1,000 cases that have happened since 1973. And pregnancy is essentially the but for pregnancy, somebody would not have been arrested, not have been forced into some kind of drug treatment, locked up in a mental hospital, forced to submit to drug treatment, whether it was appropriate or needed or anything along those lines. So when we heard about this case, it was yet another new permutation on the use of pregnancy and often drug use as a mechanism for controlling the people who get pregnant, the people who give birth, the people, none of us would be here without them. So when we heard about this case, it was, wait a minute. So here's somebody who took medical marijuana pursuant to the legal structure for exactly the reasons you're supposed to, and she's being penalized. In her case, it's not a criminal penalty, but it doesn't matter. The effects of undermining you're stigmatizing you and having state interference. I mean, even the story you've just heard, they wanted to give her services. Services for what? For being a human being who took advantage of Arizona's medical marijuana law. And in a time when marijuana has become legal everywhere for all people in the state of Arizona. So it was particularly outrageous. And interestingly, in Lindsay's case and in the Alabama case, there's this new permutation as well, which is this idea that if you're pregnant and you haven't disclosed your drug use or your pregnancy to the right people at the right time, and they haven't written it down in your medical records, you could be either liable for a crime or for prosecution for civil child neglect, which is what's happened to Lindsay. And we're seeing more and more where organizations, and this is where my friend and colleague, Deborah Small, can come in. you know, there has been this wonderful movement led by the Drug Policy Alliance and to end the war on drugs. And which is great, and looking at its impact on the criminal side of things without necessarily thinking about what the implications are for pregnant people and parents. So states decriminalized marijuana, for example, Colorado, but forgot that there's a civil child welfare law that says if you use marijuana, you can have your kids taken away. And Arizona has a particularly bad civil child neglect law that says basically if you test positive for any controlled substance, you are assumed to be a neglectful parent. So you have the absurdities of treating what a pregnant woman does during the course of her own pregnancy as a form of child abuse, and using drugs as a form of child abuse. And you put these two hot button controversial issues together, and you get this dehumanization and horrible actions against folks like Lindsay. And before I turn it over, we heard about this case. I think we got an inquiry about whether we could help. We saw it as an important cutting edge case. I spent much of my COVID time watching TV I would never probably have watched, including all of the Amy Schumer series called Expecting Amy, in which she is being followed through her whole pregnancy, in which she's performing and suffering from hyperemesis gravidarum and throwing up and throwing up and throwing up. And I actually learned a lot from that program, including how historically women were treated as if they were just hypochondriacs, and in some cases left to sit in their own vomit to teach them a lesson. And here you have somebody who's trying to use medical marijuana for precisely the kind of benefits people find that it has to deal with nausea, to deal better than with pharmaceuticals from pharmaceutical companies that don't work for everybody. And we knew that there were many, many types of organizations, particularly public health organizations, leading groups, the National Perinatal Association, leading advocacy groups like the National Council for Jewish Women, and talked to them and said, this seems wrong to us. Does it seem wrong to you? Can we represent you as friends of the court on this brief? Ending up with more than 45 experts and organizations explaining that, challenging all of the underlying medical myths and presumptions about marijuana, for which there is no evidence that causes any kind of cognitive deficit, and no evidence of causing anything that we associate with riskier with pregnancies, like lower birth weight and early gestational age. And one of the last things I'll say, it's very hard for people and courts to understand the difference between cause and risk. So there are no studies that find that marijuana causes harm. No studies that show even risk to cognitive functioning. Some studies that say, like cigarettes, it can have some impacts, but really that depends on your overall health and nutrition and stress levels. And so the assumption that in the state of Arizona, that using a controlled substance while pregnant should be treated as child neglect is something that I hope the National Council on Jewish Women will fight, along with the fight against the crazy restrictive abortion law that declares separate rights, the fiction of separate rights for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses, which leads exactly to the kind of thing that happened to a loving mother who went to term, gave birth to the beautiful Silas.
And I can't think of a better way to introduce Deborah Small into our conversation than that. Like, in what ways should we be thinking about these issues? And I want to hear about in what ways we could be better advocates for ending so much of the harm that the war on drugs has caused.
So thank you, Julie. Can you see me? I'm not able to restart my video. It says the host has stopped it. So I'm not sure who's hosting. If you want to allow me to restart my video, that would be great. If not,
we will work on it right now. We'll work on it right now.
No worries, no worries. So but as long as you can hear me, that's fine. So I want to just start by saying that even though we're having this conversation in the context of a woman who's being economically and socially and legally sanctioned for using a prescribed drug, medical marijuana, during pregnancy in a state where it was legal to do so, that we should be clear that this isn't really about marijuana. And this isn't even really about protecting fetuses, because the same people who put these laws forward are the same people who don't care about what happens to babies after they're born, who don't believe in extending health care to children, who don't believe in universal pre-K, who don't believe in supporting, providing basic social benefits for people. So this is not about that. And I think it's really important for us to make that clear, because oftentimes these conversations are had as if they're actually really about drug use, or they're actually really about protecting children or protecting women. But what this is really about is power, who gets to have it and who doesn't. It's about whether or not women have the ability to live full lives and have full autonomy over their lives, over their decisions, including their reproductive decisions, and whether or not they have the same ability as men to be able to live an autonomous life that allows them to have economic, political, and social power. I think we just really need to be clear about that. And so for me, when we talk about these things, I want to look at the big picture. What's at stake here? What is it that people are fighting for? And what are the tools that they're using for the fight? And so for me, if I see this as an issue about power, about the ability of women to have autonomous lives with the same level of equality and protection that men have, then I see that what this is really about is using the issue of drugs and drug use as a mechanism to reduce women's power and to create the fiction of fetal personhood as the legal mechanism for being able to reduce women's power. Because again, this whole conversation is framed in the way that somehow women are hurting this independent thing known as the fetus by taking something into their body that may cause harm. There's no proof that it causes harm. There's no evidence that it causes harm. In the case of Lindsay, it's clear that there was no actual harm. But under the theory that that possibility exists, we have the right to use the law in a way that hurts this woman. Now, I just want to note that in the same state, Arizona, that would do this about medical marijuana, there's nobody looking at whether or not pregnant women are forced to work 50, 60 hours a week in ways that could cause harm to their health and the health of their future babies, and that somehow that's an issue or that's a problem, or that they are undernourished or living in housing that causes a danger to themselves and their children. None of those are issues. But the theoretical potential harm that might come from using marijuana is enough of a justification to put this woman's name on a registry that would impact her life for 25 years, way past her child's adulthood. We're still going to be punishing her for something that she did while pregnant in order to ensure that she would have a healthy baby. So for me, it's like, if you just look at the facts and you look at the context of the facts, it's clear that everything about it is absurd. It's not designed to protect the woman. It's not designed to protect her child. And it's certainly not designed to protect society. So who does it protect? It protects those people who are losing the political fight about whether or not women should have choices in their reproductive lives. The vast majority of Americans, regardless of how they may feel personally about abortion, actually believe that women should have choice. And so that's like a fight where the battlegrounds have shifted. And so in order to kind of try to win that fight, what people are doing is shifting the basis of the battleground. So instead of talking about future babies, we're now talking about fetal personhood. Because if you can convince the public that you're actually protecting a person who has the same rights as you and me, then that allows you to be able to put restrictions that would not otherwise apply and that most people would not believe should apply. And so I just want us to be really clear about this and to be clear about the implications of doing this. Because even though some people may feel okay about putting restrictions on women who are pregnant based on their use of a currently illicit substance that might potentially, in some theoretical universe, cause harm to their child, are we willing to have that same conversation about women, pregnant women, when it comes to what they eat, when it comes to how they exercise, when it comes to where they travel, when it comes to a whole host of activities that theoretically could potentially cause harm? Do we really believe that the state should be able to use its power to sanction, threaten sanctions, or in any other way put barriers and constraints on women based on theoretical harms? You know, I said to Lynn when she told me about this case that this is like the Handmaid's Tale for real in Arizona. It's incredible because, you know, you look at these things and you're like, wow, you know, whoever was in the writer's room, they had a fantastical imagination. And yet we see our legislators surpassing them with actually trying to pass laws that mimic the illogic that we're seeing, you know, in dramatized versions of women's oppression. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you tonight. I believe that most of you, or many of you, based on your pictures, remember what life was like for women before Roe v. Wade. Remember the way the laws were used against women, the way that they were forced to have to give information about other people just in order to get basic services, basic health services. Well, I want you to think about the fact that not only are people trying to take us back to that place, but they're trying to take us back to that place in the context of the war on drugs, which has given law enforcement so many more tools that they can use that did not exist in the 50s and 60s when we had our previous war on abortion. We didn't have conspiracy laws that made anybody who helped you a co-conspirator. We didn't have laws that allowed the government to track everything that you do online. So if you're looking for a place to provide you services or looking for a place to provide you with the prescribed drugs that could induce a chemical abortion, that in itself could be a crime. There are so many tools that the government has. They can take your house, they can take your money, they can charge everyone around you as someone who's trying to help you. They can include your health professionals, your teachers, anybody that you may talk to. These are all tools of the drug war that can be applied and used against women who are trying to make reproductive choices that their state legislators don't approve of. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that, to be educated about what those tools are, and to fight like hell to make sure that our daughters and our granddaughters and our nieces and their children are not subject to more repression than our mothers and grandmothers were.
I'd like to underscore something that Deborah just said by what happened in the legislature in Arizona this past session. As most of you know, Arizona has some of the most draconian restrictions on access to reproductive health care. And they indeed did pass further bans on terminating pregnancy and they did try to establish personhood. What is most interesting is that there was a bill introduced in the legislature for government to subsidize prenatal dental care for pregnant women. That law they voted against. So if they care so much about even the fetus and the health of the fetus, they certainly didn't consider that. It is, as Deborah said, one agenda about control and having the courts and the legislatures determine whether or not and how and where and when women will be forced to give birth.
Yeah, and if I can chime in, the price tag on that bill was a mere $5 million, while we have a $2 billion surplus sitting in our rainy day fund. So it was not surprising that the agenda didn't include that, but still so disingenuous. I see your questions rolling in, and I promise we're going to get to them, but I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege because we have two luminaries and advocates on the line. I've got a burning question that I want to know, because at its core, the National Council for Jewish Women is an advocacy group. And I am wondering, to what extent do words matter when we advocate for these very important issues? And in which ways might we adjust our rhetoric to meet them on this new battlefield? Because it seems to me when we use their words, when we try to disprove their points, we lose every single time. So in what ways should we, the global we as advocates, be thinking about the words we choose in these issues?
I'll start if I may. First of all, an example of language and how it's used. I think one of the purposes of the so-called personhood movement, fetal personhood movement, is some of what Deborah talked about, a lot of what Deborah talked about, but also it's just so brilliant because it distracts us from real personhood movements. And a real personhood movement is Black Lives Matter. A real personhood movement is feminism. We live in a world in which there are whole bunches of people who are already born, who have never been recognized with full constitutional rights. And those include Black people, they include people with the capacity for pregnancy. And those play out in multiple ways. And so we're having this conversation about fetal personhood instead of other ones about the people who are already born. There's lots of other language that matters. Something that I will say to this crowd too, one of the reasons I formed National Advocates for Pregnant Women is having worked in my early years in the pro-choice movement, there seemed to be such fear that if we talked about pregnancy and motherhood and how we gave birth, we might then be identified only by our capacity for motherhood. And so we just, our feminism was defined for many, particularly white women, by their advocacy for the right to end a pregnancy. But the truth is we should own appreciation for all life, including potential life, which is exactly what Lindsay was doing by trying to get the healthcare she needed for her hyperemesis, which if you don't treat right, you can lose the pregnancy. Not only can you die, but you can lose the pregnancy. So I think we have to, as we think about the case going to the Supreme Court, where they're using all of this language about we're protecting fetal life. No, actually our side is the side that protects fetal life. And we have to stop being afraid about talking about babies and even unborn babies, because the people watching this, 84% of all women by the time they're in their 40s have gotten pregnant and given birth. A quarter of them have also had abortions. But they're the same people who have abortions are mothers. So one thing, we should not be afraid of that. I do think I work with my staff a lot to say, not that people are being arrested for drug use and for drug use during pregnancy, but for pregnancy and drug use, because they're both parts of the crime. You couldn't have the crime of drug use without the pregnancy part. And there have been studies that say when we say substance abuse, if somebody can abuse a substance, they can abuse a person. So drug dependency, substance use, there is language that makes a difference. But we keep learning, we adjust our language, and most importantly, we have to build power together to make sure that we're advocating for the people that deserve constitutional rights and constitutional protection. And I will add to that before I defer to Deborah, and deserve dental care as well.
So I just want to say one thing. I want to just make one point. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are not going to be able to fully hear it, but I'm going to make the point and hope that at some time in the future that people will be able to ruminate on it and open their minds a little bit. And that is that whenever we have a conversation about drugs, we're always talking about it in terms of harms and risks. It assumes things that are not true. And it assumes things that we've become comfortable inside of that assumption that we don't apply to other things. So I just wanted for a moment say that instead of talking about marijuana, suppose we were talking about sugar. Sugar is an addictive drug. Sugar affects the brain. Sugar has risk to the body. Sugar has risk to health. Too much sugar can affect a person. It could probably maybe impact their developing fetus, but I don't think that any of us think that it would be a good idea to have policies and practices that monitors and punishes people based on their sugar intake before, during, or after pregnancy, under the theoretical idea that somehow there's some magical amount of too much sugar that could be potentially harmful. This is exactly what we're doing when it comes to drugs. We assume risk, not risk that's been proven, risk that we assume. We assume harm. So everything that we say, legislatively and otherwise, when it relates to drugs, is don't do it. Women are counseled, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do any of this stuff. They don't tell them don't work. They don't say don't live with an abusive man. They don't say don't, live in a condition where you're getting paid less for your work than the guy who's next to you. We don't have laws about that necessarily. But we do think that somehow it's okay to monitor these behaviors because they could potentially be harmful. And we assume the risk and we use all of our science to prove it. When have you ever seen a study that talks about the benefits of drugs to people? Folks don't use drugs because it makes them feel bad. People use most drugs because it makes them feel good. Now, there becomes a point with some drugs where the bad begins to outweigh the good, but that has a lot to do with other things that aren't just about the drugs. But I really want us to rethink the underlying premise of all of this, which is that the particular drugs that we've identified as illegal are bad, that they're more harmful than all the legal drugs that we let people have, and that therefore they justify us punishing, restricting, sanctioning, stigmatizing, and some other way making people wrong for that. And then the second point I want us to think about is the ways in which these practices and policies are being done in order to particularly criminalize a class of women, pregnant women. Like, we don't think of pregnant women as being a suspect class that needs extra protection. But I want to suggest that maybe we should start thinking about it that way, because pregnant women have become the vehicle for people who want to accomplish another aim that doesn't have a whole lot to do with them to accomplish that goal. And these policies and practices are designed to stigmatize these women in the public mind, to make them believe that somehow babies are at risk inside the very women who are carrying them, because we have demonized these women. We've criminalized these women. We've said that they engage in harmful behaviors and therefore they need to be monitored. What if we had that same behavior about men? What would that look like? Men who are potential parents, because these babies didn't get made by themselves. But we don't have that conversation. And so I'm really asking us inside of this broader discussion to think about the underlying premises that drive them, that animate them, that keep them going. Number one, that drugs are bad and by definition harmful, and therefore whatever we can do to keep them away from people or people away from them is a good thing. And number two, that there's something about the condition of pregnancy that creates an extra burden on women that gives us the right to have more power over them, to monitor them, to control them, to say what they can and cannot do in ways that we would not do to men who have the capacity to help make a pregnancy, but not to the person who's actually carrying the life to be. And I'll stop with that.
Lynn, I saw the figures go up.
I just, there are a series of cases that we are working on a report that this notion of criminalizing pregnancy and everything else started in the late 80s and 90s. And it was the meeting of the war on drugs, the war on abortion and racism. And it targeted particularly Black women accused of smoking crack. Well, crack is just a smokable form of cocaine, which wealthy white people had been using for, decades. And where were the cocaine babies from that? So they started with the stigma, and as that will roll today, a majority of the women being arrested, the vast majority from 1973 all the way to 2005 were Black women and women of color. It's now rural white women who this happened to, and it's now starting to happen to fathers, poor fathers and fathers of color. There are 16 states where courts have said that upon their child's birth, a father could be found neglectful. Why? Because he didn't force the woman he impregnated to get drug treatment during her pregnancy. Yeah, exactly. So you got them penalized, they're neglectful fathers, but the mechanism of the penalty is to reinforce the notion that men control pregnant women and should control their women.
The Zoom box flipped over to me while you were speaking as if my eye roll was audible at that last comment. Wow. With that, I'm seeing questions roll on in, and I want to make sure, because we're almost 10 minutes to our close here, so I want to make sure we get to them. First, actually, I think it goes to Lindsay. Was DCS aware that the medication Lindsay took was prescribed by a physician? Uh-oh.
There we go.
She's still muted.
Okay. Yeah, so was GCS aware of my prescriptions being prescribed by a doctor? Yes. They got all copies of my medical records from my OB/GYN, and they also had me do a drug test right after I gave birth. So they had, the records that were in there of me, whatever I took when I was giving birth. So yeah, they had all the records that everything was prescription. They actually had the detailed records from my medical marijuana certification, because I got recertified while I was pregnant. They had those detailed records of, why I went in, the specific ailment that I got recertified for and everything.
And keep those questions coming. I do want to chime in one quick second, because it did come up in briefing, and I just thought it was one of those absurdities in Arizona law. So a physician in Arizona cannot prescribe cannabis. It's considered still a federally regulated substance. And it's actually one of the reasons why our first Medical Marijuana Act ended up failing, because it used the word prescribe, which is not something that a doctor can do. And this came up in the court that that Lindsay should have been given dosing instructions and a prescription, for cannabis, even though that is a legal and factual impossibility, and in order to overcome being charged with neglect and being placed on the registry. Okay, the other, hang on, I'm looking at your questions. All right, I think this is more of a comment. I've wanted more than anything for a movement like this to come into fruition. Is there anything I can do to support Lindsay and support this movement? I want to know. I've been through this 3 times now, and this has to stop. Well, first, to the person who posted that, yeah, you're not alone. I've fielded over 24 phone calls from patients in Arizona who've experienced this, whether they have a medical card or not, and know that this is first step in advocacy. And next step is working through this appellate process, but also getting over to the state legislature and bringing the fight there. I'm curious from our panelists, what have been effective, if any state has been effective in fighting these sorts of laws and restrictions, what our group that's gathered today can do, what works.
Actually, Deborah, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, I'm particularly proud about the fact that Oregon just voted to decriminalize possession of all drugs, because I think we've seen a lot of progress around marijuana, both medical marijuana and adult use marijuana at the state level. But we also know that that while marijuana is the #1 drug that people are arrested for, it's not the only one. And the reality is that we really need to move away from dealing with drug use and abuse as a criminal matter and deal with it as a health matter, which is what it should be addressed as overall. And so for those states like Oregon, like to some degree California and Washington State that have really taken on this whole notion that we should not be looking at the use of substances as a criminal matter and using law enforcement as our first approach, that we should really be using public health and looking at things from a public health frame is what I see as the first step. But ultimately, we need to end the failed policy of drug prohibition. It only took us 20 years to get rid of alcohol prohibition because we realized that it failed at every level. We're now going on 100 years of drug prohibition, which is as an even bigger failure than alcohol prohibition was. And I really believe if it wasn't for the fact that the war on drugs has been a really convenient tool for racial oppression, we would have gotten rid of it a long time ago.
Well, I totally agree. And I have the more particular action fantasy for all of you that you could make a reality. And in particular, Arizona has one of the worst civil child welfare laws in the country. A positive drug test equals that you can't parent, which is absurd. People drink, people use drugs. It is not, if I give you a cup of my pee, you cannot test it for my parenting ability. All you can do is test it to see if I have used a particular drug within a particular time. It doesn't tell you if I love my child, if I cook them dinner, if I prioritize them over everything else on earth. All it tells you is I used a drug. And in Arizona, those drug tests, which I'm sure your taxpayer dollars are paying for, is used to determine parenting ability. So I'm happy. Anybody want to test my pee and tell me how well I parent? I'm happy to make that available. But so my first I have to honor Julie. Lindsay, you're so lucky to have her as your lawyer. It was one of the best appellate briefs I've ever read. It was just incredibly impressive. But Arizona was one of several states who at the end of last year decriminalized marijuana generally, and then became, of those states, the first to start actually selling it and making it available to people. So what I would like to see you do is go every day to those places where people are waiting on lines or going in, and tell them about this law and tell them it is time to tell their legislators to repeal it, that they're at risk if they are parents or pregnant, whether they know they're pregnant or not, of being subjected to these insane civil child neglect law, and that they should fight it, that they should get high and fight this law. Tell people that it has to be repealed.
And if they're not willing to do that, I propose a counter law that any Arizona public official who can be proven to have told easily provable lie on the record should then have their parenting ability questioned. Because I think a whole lot of people who work for the Arizona state government, particularly on one side of the aisle, might find some real problems if they had to be held accountable for the lies that they've told, for the provable lies that they've told. And if those things could be held against them as parents, it makes as much sense to do that as it does to take somebody's child away for using marijuana. So if you're going to do it for one thing, let's do it for something more serious, like telling lies that cause people lives or that could potentially overturn a valid election.
And I don't want to get in trouble with my staff, who also said, made me promise to say that we are so proud to have organized and represented the 45 organizations and individuals on this amicus brief. But the truth is, none of them paid us to do this work. So when you're thinking about how to help this movement continue, one of the ways to do that is to support national advocates for pregnant women. So I'll send to the host our link, and hopefully you'll make good use of it, and we'll continue this work. We're ready to fight with Lindsay and Julie if this case has to go up. And there was good news today that there's positive response.
Thank you. Thank you all. We're almost out of time, so we are just so grateful to have the panelists, especially for Lindsay to be here with us, and your courage and commitment to allowing your experience be a vehicle for changing the laws and helping other people. We have a strange duality in this state and in 37 other states across the country. We have the hypocrisy of forced childbirth on one hand by restricting access to termination, and on the other, the harsh penalties for those who want to carry pregnancy to term, but whose conduct and behavior is deemed threatening, menacing to the fetus. So we've discussed that. What I would like to do is pose a very quick summary, a few seconds. How do we combat this? How do we deal with the Hippocratic mentality of these legislatures that would refuse termination, but yet penalize women who want to carry to term? Lynn?
Well, you just, unfortunately, our opponents are not easily embarrassed, and exposing their hypocrisy is not enough. And so it is advocacy organizations that have to, even if they don't win every election, they have to keep running. They have to take back every office at every level that they possibly can. And we have to recognize that our fight is not just about abortion, but as you point out, it is about the personhood of the people who get pregnant, and the need to assure that there is support for those people. I just keep coming back to everybody watching this webinar would not be here but for somebody who got pregnant. So that has to be a priority on the political agenda, and we should figure out how to have some fun while we're doing it.
Thank you. Deborah?
So I just want to point out that we're now 100 years since women won the right to vote. And I say won because no one gave it to us. We fought for it. We won it. And the idea was to be able to have an impact on the political decisions that impact our lives. And I have to say that I think many of those women would be disappointed to see 100 years in how little power we still have over the decisions that impact our lives. And one of the most basic decisions is about your reproductive life, because that impacts your economic life, your educational life, every other aspect of your life. And so what I see is us in a fight that's very similar to the fight that took place after the Civil War, post-Reconstruction, where you had a period of real advancement in racial justice in this country that was charting a new course. We're coming at the end of a period of real advancement in women's rights in a way that is threatening to the white male supremacy mindset that has run this country from its inception. And one of the things that we know from the history of social movements, that it's at the point where you're actually starting to get real power and parity, that you get the worst backlash.
Right.
So I think we have to recognize the period that we're in for what it is, a response to the amount of progress that women have made, and that we have to stick with the fight to recognize that on the other side of this vicious battle that we're in right now is a much greater degree of freedom for us and the women who are coming after us. But if we're not willing to stay engaged and actually continue in this fight, then the women behind us are going to have the Sisyphean task of having to roll that ball back up to the point where we are on the hill before they can get it even higher.
Julie.
I'm not sure I can say it better than that, but I do want to talk real quick about why our opponents are so loud and why they sound so loud. And the other day it was pointed out to me that it's a minuscule group that was able to get their message to their base and their base to repeat it endlessly. And that's the same thing that we can do here. Once we have those words, it is so important, not that we're saying what's popular, but that we're making popular what needs to be said. And in this regard, even getting folks like Lindsay to be able to speak up and have a voice and not be so scared, and for you all to repeat her message about why this is important and how this affects people, and to not be frightened about addressing drugs in pregnancy, which is highly stigmatized. That's how we get loud. And I think that's the change that we really need to make as we're looking at 2022 and beyond.
Agreed. Lindsay, is there something you would like to close with?
I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to you all for submitting to the brief, for coming tonight to listen. Thank you to everyone reaching out to Julie for help. I think that's great, and I really hope we make some change.
We do too. Again, I want to thank our panelists, but I also would like to emphasize for everybody who is participating, we need you to be engaged. You cannot sit on the sidelines, whether it is supporting national advocates, whether it is supporting Break the Chains, and certainly joining us as a grassroots advocacy organization that impacts policy from the State House to the White House. We have a task force on reproductive rights and reproductive health care access. Join us so that you can make your voice heard. I'd like to end it by saying that the theme of our last gala and our ongoing theme is power and persistence of making our voices heard for change. So thank you again. Get involved. Do not sit on the sidelines. Help win this battle. Thank you and good night.